When my HOA stole the road that legally belonged to me, they thought I was powerless. But instead of fighting with words, I made every single one of their cars vanish into thin air. And what happened next destroyed their entire empire. The road that wasn't theirs in the quiet heart of an upscale neighborhood, where hedges were clipped into perfect spheres and driveways shone from fresh washes. One man lived on the edge of order and chaos. His name was David. Unlike his neighbors, who bought their quarter-acre lots with matching homes, David's property had a strange distinction. His land stretched wider than most, inherited from his grandfather, and carried with it something the HOA never liked to acknowledge: ownership of the narrow road that connected the neighborhood to the main street. It wasn't a grand highway, just a simple stretch of pavement, but it was essential. Every resident passed down that road daily, and for years they assumed it was theirs by right. They planted flowers at its edge, painted speed bumps, even installed a neighborhood watch sign. Yet, on paper, the road belonged entirely to David. He had the deed, the surveys, and the legal standing to prove it. For a long time, David never minded. He was the kind of man who enjoyed peace, not confrontation. If people drove by, parked along the side, or used the shortcut, it didn't bother him. He saw it as a small way of keeping the neighborhood running smoothly, a silent gift he gave to people who barely knew his name. But peace rarely lasts in places ruled by homeowners associations. The HOA board, made up of sharp smiles and stricter rules, had begun looking at that stretch of asphalt with hungry eyes. To them, it wasn't just a road, it was an opportunity. They whispered in meetings about liability, control, and beautification projects. They told themselves they were protecting the community, but behind those closed doors, what they really wanted was power, and the road was the last piece of the puzzle they didn't own. The first sign of trouble came when workers appeared one early morning, placing orange cones and digging into the shoulder of the road. David watched from his porch, puzzled, as they laid down new gravel and painted fresh stripes. At first, he thought maybe it was a city project, something municipal. But the city had no jurisdiction here. This was private land, his land, and no one had asked his permission. The next week, new signs appeared, bright metal plaques that read, HOA property, residents only. David's stomach tightened as he read the bold letters. It wasn't just disrespect, it was theft, painted in white reflective paint for all to see. His neighbors waved happily as they drove over what was now, apparently, HOAS road. But no one noticed David standing silently, watching something that was his vanish without a word. He tried to remain calm, telling himself it was a misunderstanding. But the situation grew darker. The HOA began enforcing rules on their road. Cars parked too long were ticketed with fines slipped under their wipers. Delivery trucks were told they couldn't linger. The road was being patrolled like it was part of their little empire. And the arrogance of it made David's blood boil. One evening, a letter arrived in his mailbox, stamped with the HOAS official seal. It was a notice of assessment, a demand that David, along with every other homeowner, contribute funds toward the maintenance of the community roadway. His name was printed like all the others, as if his ownership meant nothing. They weren't just taking his road, they were making him pay for their theft. That night, David sat in his study, pulling out the thick folder of documents his grandfather had left him. Deeds, maps, surveys, all clear as day. The road was his, and yet here they were, rewriting history with signs and paper. He thought of confronting them, standing before the board, shouting until they backed down. But David knew the type of people he was dealing with. The HOA thrived on conflict, on wearing people down with rules and fines until they gave in. So he said nothing. Not yet. He let them build their illusion of control, let them strut around and collect their fees, let them ticket cars and hold meetings about their property. He waited, because David was not a man of rash decisions. He was a man of patience, and patience is the sharpest blade in the dark. The real breaking point came a month later. David returned home from work to find a freshly paved speed bump at the entrance of the road. At its base was a sign that read, HOA installation, complaints will be ignored. That was when David knew there was no turning back. They hadn't just taken his road, they had declared war. He spent the night pacing, His mind running wild with ideas, the HOA thought they were untouchable, that their rules gave them power. But David held something stronger than rules. He held ownership. And with ownership came the kind of authority they could never take, not legally, not morally, not in reality. By the time the sun rose the next morning, David had already decided what he would do. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't argue. He wouldn't show up at their meetings with a stack of papers begging for recognition. No, he would show them what it meant to cross someone who had been silent too long. He would teach them the price of arrogance, not with words, but with actions. And it would all begin with the very thing they prized most, their cars. Because if the HOA thought they could take his road without asking, then David would show them what it meant when every single car that relied on that road simply vanished. The blueprint of revenge. David's mind was sharper than most of his neighbors gave him credit for. They saw a quiet man who tended to his garden, waved politely at the mailbox, and never raised his voice in meetings. But inside his calm demeanor lived the methodical patience of someone who studied problems from every angle before moving. The HOA had mistaken his silence for weakness. That mistake would cost them more than they could imagine. The first days after his decision were spent in careful observation. He took evening walks along the road, not because he enjoyed them, but because he needed to memorize patterns. He studied when cars came and went, which households filled the road at night, which vehicles stayed parked for hours without movement. His eyes tracked delivery trucks, patrol cars hired by the HOA, and even the board members' own shiny SUVs. Every detail mattered. He realized quickly that the HOA treated the road as their stage, their proof of power. Board members parked their cars with smug boldness, often in places that blocked others, as if claiming the pavement was their throne. Neighbors grew accustomed to it, whispering but never confronting. The road had become a silent battlefield, and every tire that rolled across it was a declaration that David no longer mattered. That only fueled him further. David had the advantage of knowledge. The road, though seemingly ordinary, carried hidden quirks only the true owner would know. There was a thin patch near the oak tree where the soil softened each spring, making the ground unstable. Near the far bend, an old drainage pipe ran beneath, creating a hollow echo when heavy vehicles passed. These little details were invisible to most, but David had grown up with them. His grandfather had told him stories of laying gravel by hand, of reinforcing corners with steel rods. The road wasn't just his property, it was his inheritance, his legacy. And now it would be his weapon. The plan came together slowly, piece by piece, like assembling a machine. He wasn't going to slash tires or smash windows. That was petty, obvious, and illegal. No, his revenge would be cleaner, smarter, and far more terrifying. He wanted the HOA to feel powerless, the way they had made him feel when they slapped their signs on his land. It began with research. David spent late nights at his computer, reading forums about private property enforcement, studying obscure laws, and exploring stories of others who had fought back against HOA letters. He stumbled across a particularly interesting detail. As the sole legal owner of the road, he had the right to control access entirely. That meant anyone who parked there did so at his discretion. If he wanted, he could tow them all away without notice. But David didn't just want to tow cars. That would end too quickly, with board members paying fines and moving on. He wanted something unforgettable, an experience that would leave the HOA shaken, questioning their very grip on the community. He wanted them to lose not just their cars, but their sense of safety. That was when the idea struck him. The cars wouldn't just be removed, they would vanish. Over the following week, David contacted a discreet towing company he had once used for his business. He didn't mention the HOA. Instead, he explained that he owned a private road and wanted vehicles removed on short notice. Money wasn't an issue, the company agreed, though they raised eyebrows at his insistence on absolute confidentiality. David arranged storage space on a piece of unused land his cousin owned outside of town. It was isolated, surrounded by trees, with enough room to line up rows of cars where no one would stumble upon them. To anyone else, it looked like abandoned property. To David, it was the perfect hiding ground. The final step was psychological. He didn't want his neighbors to suspect him immediately. He needed the vanishings to feel like a mystery, a force no one could explain. That way, the HOAS authority would crumble from within as panic replaced order. So he tested small tricks. First, late one night, he quietly moved a single sedan belonging to one of the board members. He had it towed and placed neatly in the hidden lot. By morning, the neighborhood buzzed with confusion. The owner stormed around accusing delivery drivers, pranksters, even the police. But there was no evidence, no broken glass, no sign of theft. It was as if the car had been plucked from existence. David watched from his porch, sipping coffee as arguments flared. He said nothing, only offered a polite shrug when asked if he had noticed anything unusual. That silence made him invisible, and invisibility was his greatest weapon. Encouraged, he escalated. A few days later, 2 more cars disappeared overnight. This time, both belonged to HOA enforcers, the ones who had been writing tickets along their road. The outrage was louder, sharper, and tinged with fear. People whispered about organized crime, about gangs, about secret feuds. The HOA board scrambled to reassure residents, holding emergency meetings that produced no answers. And all the while, David listened from the shadows, his plan unfolding exactly as he envisioned. It wasn't about the cars themselves, it was about control. The HOA had taken control of his road, and now he was taking control of everything they valued. Every time a vehicle vanished, their authority cracked. Their rules looked flimsy, their fines laughable, their signs like lies nailed to poles. David knew the next step would be bigger. The disappearances couldn't remain random forever. He needed to strike hard enough that the entire neighborhood realized something deeper was happening. The HOA needed to feel cornered, exposed, and utterly powerless. And the perfect opportunity was already on the horizon. A board meeting was scheduled in just 3 days. Every member would be present, their shiny cars lined up neatly along the stolen road like trophies. David smiled to himself as he pictured at the sight of those cars, gleaming under the streetlights, only to vanish into the night as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The HOA had declared war when they took his road. Now he was about to show them what war really looked like. The night of vanishing Angonist day of the HOA board meeting arrived with the same pomp and arrogance David had grown used to seeing. The board members had a flair for dramatics, and they treated every gathering like a performance. Flyers had been posted on mailboxes, reminding residents to attend and support the future of the community roadway. The audacity of the phrase almost made David laugh. They were parading his stolen road as if it were their grand accomplishment. By late afternoon, the street began to fill with cars, SUVs with tinted windows, sedans polished to a mirror shine, and trucks carrying banners of neighborhood pride, lined up in smug rows along the pavement. The board members stepped out dressed in neat suits and sharp dresses, carrying clipboards, talking loudly as though the world depended on their decisions. Residents trickled in, some eager, others reluctant, all unaware that the night would end in chaos. David watched quietly from his porch. His demeanor gave nothing away. To the neighbors who waved, he returned polite nods, just another homeowner, observing the meeting preparations. But in his garage, hidden from sight, the real work was ready. He had already coordinated with the towing company, arranging the timing to perfection. Engines would roar into action the moment the meeting reached its peak. As the sun dipped below the horizon, porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood, casting long shadows on the road. Folding chairs were set up in neat rows outside the clubhouse, and the board took their positions at a long table. They spoke with authority, outlining new rules, new fines, and even plans to install gates at the entrance of the community gates that would stand proudly on David's land without his permission. The hypocrisy burned him to his core, but he stayed silent. He didn't need to argue. His revenge was already in motion. At precisely 8 o'clock, when the meeting was in full swing and residents were distracted by speeches and charts, headlights glimmered faintly at the far end of the road. David's heart pounded with a quiet thrill as the first tow truck rolled into place, then another and another. Like shadows slipping between houses, the trucks moved in near silence, their drivers working with practiced precision. One by one, the cars began to vanish. Hooks latched onto tires, hydraulics hissed, and engines were lifted effortlessly into the night. The board members' gleaming SUVs, their pride and joy, were among the first to go, within minutes. Rows of vehicles that had been symbols of power were nothing more than empty spaces on the asphalt. David timed it so the process remained unnoticed until it was too late. The meeting carried on, the board droning about community standards and financial responsibility, until a resident stood and asked why half the parking row looked suspiciously bare. Heads turned, murmurs spread, and the first wave of panic rippled through the crowd. Board members leapt from their chairs, rushing to where their cars had been parked. The sight of empty pavement struck like a hammer. Fingers pointed, accusations flew, and voices rose into chaos. Some insisted it must be theft, others claimed the city had towed them, while a few whispered about organized retaliation. The board tried to calm them, but the fear was too sharp, too immediate. Neighbors fumbled for their phones, calling police, calling towing companies, calling anyone who might have answers. But no one had seen the trucks slip away. No one had heard the engines. To the neighborhood, it was as if the cars had evaporated into thin air. David remained on his porch, sipping tea as the scene unfolded. He was invisible in the frenzy, just another onlooker watching the storm. But inside, he felt a deep satisfaction. This wasn't just revenge. This was balance. The HOA had stolen his road in broad daylight, and now their possessions had been stolen in the shadows. The night spiraled further into madness. Police cruisers arrived, their lights painting the manicured lawns in red and blue. Officers questioned frantic board members, wrote down license plates of the missing vehicles, and shook their heads at the sheer scale of it. Never had they seen so many cars disappear at once without a trace. The HOA board tried to take control of the situation, demanding answers from the officers. But their authority looked hollow under the flashing lights. Residents no longer listened. With respect, they demanded accountability. After all, hadn't the HOA promised the road was theirs? Hadn't they sworn to protect it? Now, with their cars gone, the board's promises looked like lies written on cheap paper. The meeting disbanded in chaos, neighbors shouting, board members pacing like trapped animals, and the sound of sirens echoing down the stolen road. But even as fear gripped the community, a deeper seed had been planted: doubt. The residents began to question not just where the cars had gone, but who truly held power in the neighborhood. And David, calm and quiet in his chair, knew that this was only the beginning. Cars were just the first layer. The HOA still hadn't learned the lesson he wanted them to learn. They still strutted with arrogance, believing the world revolved around their rules. But now, with their possessions stripped away and their authority cracking, he had the perfect stage to escalate further. The neighborhood was unsettled, the board was desperate, and the road they had stolen still belonged to him. The night ended with flashing lights fading into darkness, leaving silence heavy over the manicured lawns. But David was already planning the next move. The board's pride had been shaken. Now, he would aim for their control itself, because if the HOA thought losing their cars was terrifying, they hadn't yet imagined what it meant to lose the neighborhood entirely. A neighborhood in panic. Morning after the board meeting dawned heavy with unease. Normally, the neighborhood stirred awake with predictable rhythms: garage doors opening, sprinklers hissing, the hum of cars leaving for work. But that day, silence stretched across the manicured streets. Driveways stood empty where vehicles once gleamed. Neighbors lingered on porches, whispering, their eyes darting from house to house in suspicion. The police had stayed long into the night, canvassing the area, questioning residents, and taking reports. Yet, their presence brought little comfort. The officers admitted they had no leads. There were no broken locks, no shattered glass, no surveillance footage of suspicious activity. It was as though the missing cars had been swallowed by the earth. Fear spread quickly. Some residents worried about safety, murmuring about gangs or professional thieves targeting the community. Others suspected inside involvement, pointing fingers at the HOA itself. After all, who else claimed such dominion over the road? Who else had been handing out fines and tickets just days before? The board scrambled to regain control. They called an emergency meeting, though far fewer residents attended. Trust had begun to fracture. The board's promises of order sounded thin when their own vehicles had been the first to disappear. Some accused them outright of staging the thefts for insurance money, while others whispered about corruption, greed, or secret deals gone wrong. David, as always, stayed on the sidelines, invisible in plain sight. He attended the gathering like everyone else, listening quietly as the board flailed for authority. They hired private security to patrol the road, announced new surveillance cameras would be installed, and swore the neighborhood was safe. Their tone was stern, but their eyes betrayed them. They were shaken, desperate to claw back control that had slipped through their fingers. Yet their solutions carried both promise and danger. On one hand, increased patrols and cameras could deter outsiders and reassure residents. On the other hand, they risked fueling paranoia further, making neighbors feel watched rather than protected. The board believed these measures would tighten their grip, but David saw the cracks widening. The paranoia only grew when, a few nights later, two more vehicles vanished. Not board members this time, but ordinary residents who had done nothing more than park along the road overnight. That was when the community turned on itself. Some demanded curfews, insisting no one park on the street after dark. Others accused their own neighbors of betrayal, pointing at anyone who had grudges or financial troubles. Friendships fractured. Conversations became arguments. The HOA's carefully crafted image of unity dissolved into suspicion. David observed it all with calculated calm. The brilliance of his plan wasn't just in removing cars, it was in removing certainty. People could accept theft if it made sense, if it followed patterns. But this was chaos wrapped in silence. The randomness of it made everyone feel vulnerable, and vulnerability eroded loyalty faster than any argument. Police patrols increased, private guards walked the sidewalks, and security cameras sprouted like weeds along the fences. Yet still, the cars kept vanishing. Every disappearance was a reminder that the HOA wasn't in control. No matter how many rules they wrote or how many lights they installed, the neighborhood, once proud of its order, now pulsed with fear. In private, David wrestled with his choices. On the surface, everything was going exactly as planned. The HOA was cracking, their authority bleeding out under the weight of confusion. But part of him wondered how far was too far. He could stop now, reveal the truth, and bask in their humiliation. He had already proved his point. Yet another part of him whispered that it wasn't enough. The HOA had stolen without remorse, and their arrogance demanded a harsher lesson. If he stopped now, they might rebuild, might rewrite the story to paint themselves as victims. But if he continued, he could destroy their influence entirely, ensuring they never dared cross him or anyone else again. That was the balance David weighed in the quiet of his study, the pros and cons of vengeance. On one side, escalation meant more fear, more instability, and the risk of unintended consequences. Innocent neighbors were already suffering, their cars gone, their peace shattered. On the other side, pulling back too soon meant the HOA could recover, twist the narrative, and emerge stronger. The choice gnawed at him, but his resolve held. He would not let the HOA rewrite history. They had declared ownership of something that was never theirs. They had mocked him with their signs, their rules, their smug disregard. To stop now would be to let them believe they had won. So David decided the vanishings would continue, but this time, he would push further than before. The cars were just the beginning. Next, he would strike at the very symbols of the HOAS, control the signs, the tickets, the speed bumps they had installed without permission. Piece by piece, he would erase their empire until nothing remained but silence. The road was his, and soon, the neighborhood would learn it had always belonged to him. Dismantling the Empirith disappearances alone had been enough to shake the neighborhood. But David knew cars were only the surface. They were personal losses, yes, but temporary ones. Vehicles could be replaced. Insurance could cover costs, and memories of panic would fade. If he wanted to ensure the HOA never regained its power, he had to cut deeper. He had to dismantle the illusion of authority they had built piece by piece until no one believed in it anymore. The first strike was subtle. One morning, residents awoke to find that every HOA property, residents' only sign along the road, had vanished overnight. Poles stood bare, bolts twisted free, leaving nothing but empty patches of soil. At first, people assumed vandals had struck, but the precision told another story. There was no spray paint, no crude damage, no mess left behind. The signs had simply been removed, as though they had never existed. The board scrambled to replace them, holding an emergency vote to fund new signage. But within days, the replacements disappeared as well. No matter how many they ordered, no matter how firmly they bolted them down, the signs would vanish by morning. The road, once proudly stamped with HOA ownership, returned to silence neutral. Untamed, uncontrollable. Next came the speed bumps. The HOA had paraded them as safety measures, though in truth, they were just another mark of their control. David remembered the frustration of feeling those jolts beneath his tires, reminders of rules he had never agreed to. One night, while the neighborhood slept, he hired a discreet crew to grind them flat. By dawn, the asphalt lay smooth again, unmarked and natural, as though the bumps had been a bad dream. The reaction was immediate. Board members fumed, shouting about vandalism and demanding answers. But residents, secretly relieved, didn't seem upset. For the first time, they questioned why the bumps had been there in the first place. Had they really been necessary? Or had they simply been another way for the HOA to flex its power? The board's cries for outrage fell flat against neighbors' quiet sighs of relief. David didn't stop there. He knew the HOA's true power wasn't in signs or bumps, it was in paper, letters, tickets, fines. Notices slipped into mailboxes like constant reminders that someone was always watching. So, he targeted their system, one by one. He removed the stacks of fine notices before they reached residents. Some he burned, others he shredded, until entire weeks passed without a single warning being delivered. Confusion spread. Neighbors whispered that maybe the board was backing down, that maybe their power was fading. When residents called to ask about missing notices, the HOA denied it, claiming the letters had been sent, but without proof, without paper in hand. Their words sounded hollow. The board looked incompetent, unable to explain their own failure to enforce. The tipping point came when one of the board's most arrogant members, a woman named Patricia who had led the charge to claim the road, tried to hold a rally in the clubhouse. She stood at the front, declaring that order must be restored, that whoever was behind the sabotage would be caught. But as she spoke, residents noticed something peculiar outside. The HOA's golf cart, the vehicle they used to patrol the streets, was gone, vanished like the cars before it. The timing was perfect. The rally collapsed into laughter, whispers, and outright mockery. Patricia's authority crumbled in real time, her words drowned out by the realization that even the board's own tools weren't safe. The neighborhood was unraveling. The very people who had once followed the HOA's every command now began to rebel quietly. Some stopped paying dues, muttering that the board no longer protected them. Others openly challenged rules, daring the HOA to enforce anything when they couldn't even keep their own cars or signs intact. David observed all of this with calculated detachment. He wasn't gloating, wasn't celebrating. He simply watched the balance restore itself. For years, the HOA had held the community in a grip of fear of fines, fear of rules, fear of being singled out. Now, that fear had shifted. It was the board itself that trembled, that doubted, that questioned every shadow. Yet even as their empire crumbled, David knew he had to remain cautious. He had gone further than he originally planned. Each move tightened the noose, but also increased the risk of exposure. The police were still investigating the disappearances, and though suspicion hadn't yet turned toward him, the possibility lingered still. The satisfaction was undeniable. The road was quiet again, stripped of its stolen symbols. Cars no longer lined it with arrogance. Signs no longer declared false ownership. The bumps were gone, the tickets silenced. For the first time in months, David felt the land breathe freely beneath him. But deep down, he knew this story wasn't finished. The HOA wasn't dead yet. Broken, humiliated, stripped of power. Yes, but desperate organizations often lash out in their final moments, and desperation can make people dangerous. The neighborhood had turned against its rulers. But the board still clung to the belief that they could recover. David could see it in their frantic eyes at meetings, in their whispered conversations. As they paced the sidewalks, they were plotting, searching for one last card to play. And David knew that when they made their final move, he would have to decide whether to reveal himself or disappear into the shadows forever, because some wars end with peace, but others end with silence. The ghost of the road HOA board was in ruins. Their cars had vanished, their signs were gone, their speed bumps flattened, and their tickets silenced. What had once been a machine of control now limped along on fumes, mocked by neighbors who no longer feared them. But broken organizations don't surrender gracefully. In their desperation, the board made one last attempt to claw back power. It began with whispers of an investigation. Board members claimed they had hired private detectives, professionals who would uncover the culprit behind the sabotage. They spoke in hushed but determined tones at what remained of their meetings, promising justice, swearing that whoever had humiliated them would be dragged into the light. They underestimated David's patience. He had spent weeks, months orchestrating every move from the shadows. He had left no trail, no careless mistakes, nothing that could be tied back to him. The towing company had been discreet, the storage lot secured, the removals planned with military precision. He was invisible, not because he was lucky, but because he had made himself so still. The detectives brought tension to the neighborhood. They asked questions, knocked on doors, loitered near driveways. They sifted through rumors, but each story contradicted the last. Some residents claimed outsiders were to blame, others swore it was teenagers, and a few suggested it was an inside job by the board itself. The chaos David had sown was too deep, too tangled for truth to shine through. But the board didn't stop there. As a final show of strength, they announced plans to install a gate at the entrance of the community. It would stand tall, gleaming with false authority, locking out anyone without their approval. It was an act of desperation, a way to say, "We still control you." David knew he couldn't allow it. A gate wasn't just metal and hinges, it was a wall, a permanent mark that would erase his quiet victory. The board would wave it like a banner of survival, claiming they had endured, that they still ruled, and worse, it would stand on his land. So David planned one last strike. On the night the construction equipment arrived, he moved quietly through the shadows. The trucks stood idle, the materials stacked neatly by the roadside. He didn't need to sabotage them with noise or fire. Instead, he called in the same towing crew that had served him faithfully before. Within hours, the trucks and materials were gone, whisked away into the night. By dawn, the empty lot looked as though nothing had ever been delivered. The board woke to humiliation once again. Their grand project had vanished before it even began. To the residents, it was the final joke, the last proof that the HOA had no real power left. Laughter spread through the neighborhood, quiet at first, then open, defiant. The board's authority collapsed completely, leaving them little more than figureheads presiding over their own failure. And David? He watched it all unfold from his porch, the way he always had, silent, patient, unseen. He had not only reclaimed his road, but dismantled the false empire built upon it. His land was his again, not through arguments or courtrooms, but through quiet, calculated force. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board resigned one by one, each departure cloaked in shame. The neighborhood, once bound by fear of fines and rules, became freer, looser, more human. Neighbors spoke to each other without the board looming over them. Laughter returned to the streets, and the road, David's road, remained untouched, unmarked, neutral once more. Yet David never revealed his role to the community. The mystery remained unsolved, a ghost story whispered at block parties and late-night gatherings. Some swore it had been a criminal gang. Others believed the road itself was cursed, rejecting the board's arrogance. A few still suspected inside betrayal, but had no proof. David preferred it that way. He didn't need recognition. He didn't want credit. The power of his actions lay in the silence, in the uncertainty that would haunt the HOA long after its death. By vanishing their cars, their signs, their tickets, their gate, he had shown them the truth. Authority is nothing without consent. And so the neighborhood moved on. The lawns grew, The houses stood tall, and life resumed its rhythm. But every time a neighbor drove down that stretch of asphalt, smooth and silent under their tires, they felt it, that lingering sense that the road belonged to someone unseen, someone who had reminded them that power, once abused, could be taken away in the quietest of ways. David remained the ghost of the road, and that was enough.